For many years, slave owners justified their actions and cruelties on the basis that the slaves had no aptitude to function as independent human beings. However, in the late 19th century, one man rose to become a counterexample to all of the slave owners' arguments that slaves lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. Known for his oratory, his powerful writings, and his activism, Frederick Douglass became a symbol of hope for African Americans in slavery. He didn't just give them hope. Frederick Douglass was actively involved in ensuring their freedom. In this video, we will be looking at the life of Frederick Douglass, his escape from slavery, his journey towards freedom, his success on self-education, and his efforts towards championing the abolition of slavery in America.
Born a slave, he rose to become a prominent abolitionist, statesman, author, and respected figure around the world.
This is the most photographed American of the 19th century.
True legend, truly one of the greatest to ever do it.
Frederick Douglass is one of history's most famous figures, a public speaker, a writer, and a fearless campaigner for equality for all.
And in addition to his advocacy, he is legit one of the best writers America has ever produced.
Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Talbot County, Maryland. There is no clear record of his actual date of birth, but it gives an estimate that he was born in 1817 and chose to celebrate his birthday on the 14th of February. Frederick was called Little Valentine by his mother when he was very young. He was of mixed race, a Native American and African on his mother's side, and a white father. He was born a slave, and after he was separated from his mother in infancy, he was sent to live with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who was also a slave, although his grandfather, Isaac, was a free man. His mother worked at a plantation that was about 19 kilometers away from his grandmother's. He visited a few times, but she died when Frederick was just 7 years old. He struggled to survive under the harsh treatment from the slave masters. Oftentimes, he slept on the floor and struggled to even get food to eat. Frederick didn't have the opportunity of going to school and had to teach himself. He learned how to spell by checking out the old Webster's spelling book. He started reading by checking out posters that were placed on the cellars and doors of the barn. He read them and tried to copy them as well. To learn how to speak well, he usually bribed white boys with the little ration of bread he got. At the age of 6, after being separated from his grandparents, Frederick was moved to the White House plantation. After his master died in 1826, he was again sent to Baltimore to serve another family. In Baltimore, he was treated well, had good clothes on, ate good food, and slept under a warm blanket. The wife of his master, Sophia, was very kind to him and ensured that he was treated the way a human being ought to be treated. Sophia also started teaching him the alphabet when he turned 12, but her husband disapproved of this. He thought that educating slaves would encourage them to desire freedom. It was at this moment that Douglass learned that knowledge makes a child unfit to be a slave. And with this, he understood that education was the path that would move him from slavery to freedom. Sadly for Douglass, Sophia was influenced by her husband and also believed that education and slavery cannot go together, and so she stopped teaching him how to read. One day, she caught him looking at a newspaper and quickly snatched it away from him. She hid her Bible and every other reading material from Douglass. However, Douglass wasn't one to give up immediately, and so he continued learning from the white kids in the neighborhood and by observing the writings of the men with whom he worked. He continued teaching himself how to read discreetly, constantly reminding himself that knowledge is the pathway to freedom. He learned how to read so well and spent most of his time reading newspapers, pamphlets, political materials, and different kinds of books. The more he read, the more he became aware of the wickedness of the institution of slavery and how wrong it was. One book he read that changed his life was The Columbian Orator. He read this book when he was 12, and from this book, he understood freedom and human rights. The book had so many speeches, dialogues, and essays that helped Douglass learn to read better and even learn proper grammar. As Douglass grew, he made it his mission to constantly educate the other slaves around him. When he was hired by William Freeland, Douglass usually brought together about 30 male slaves on weeknights and Sundays and guided them on how to read. After some years, Douglass was sold to a very wicked slave master with a terrible reputation of being a slave breaker. He frequently whipped and flogged Douglass such that his wounds had very little time to heal in between floggings. The flogging really broke Douglass's spirit and affected him physically as well. However, when he got to 16, he was able to rebel against the beatings and fought back whenever he was about to be flogged. After he won this physical confrontation, his master never tried to beat him again. He tried his first attempt to escape from his master, Freeland, in 1837, but it was unsuccessful. He returned back, and then he met and fell in love with Anna Murray. Anna was a free black woman who was 5 years older than Douglass and lived in Baltimore. Douglass became resolute in his quest for freedom after he met Anna, and her free status strengthened his belief in the possibility of gaining his own freedom. Murray was very supportive and provided Douglass with the money and encouragement he needed. On September 3rd, 1838, Douglass finally got his chance and was able to successfully escape from his master by boarding a northbound train of the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad. Finally, the young Douglass was able to reach Havre de Grace, Maryland, in Hartford County. With this newfound freedom, Douglass said that he lived more in one day than in a year of his slave life. He was so joyous and excited that he felt as one might feel upon escaping from a den of hungry lions. And as soon as he had escaped, he called for Anna to join him in New York. He got married to her on September 15, 1838. They were wedded by a black Presbyterian minister. He and his wife later moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, and started a new life. This area was filled with so many former slaves and even became the center for various other abolitionist movements. Douglass initially used his mother's surname, Bailey, but after escaping slavery, he adopted the name Stanley and later chose Johnson. But noticing that the name was so common, he chose Douglass after reading the poem, The Lady of the Lake. He wanted a name that was more distinctive. After settling in Bedford, Frederick thought of joining a white Methodist church, but changed his mind the very first day he went to the church and discovered that it was segregated. He later found and joined the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. It was there he met the other African Americans fighting for the liberty and equality of slaves, such as Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. In 1839, Douglass became a licensed preacher. With this platform, he developed his oratorical skills while he delivered sermons. He was dedicated to the church and served as the steward, Sunday school superintendent, as well as the sexton. Douglass was full of life and energy and joined several organizations in New Bedford, where he was keen on attending any abolitionist meeting he heard of. He also subscribed to William Lloyd Garrison's weekly newspaper, The Liberator. It was from the reading of this paper that Douglass developed a new hatred of slavery. Douglass later confessed that the paper took a special place in his heart, second only to the Bible. Garrison became a major influence in the life of Douglass, and from him, he learned a lot about the anti-slavery movement and the efforts towards the abolition of slavery. Douglass delivered a speech when he was just 23 at the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society's annual convention in Nantucket. In this powerful speech, he spoke about his rough life as a slave and his escape to freedom. He was also an ardent protester against segregated transportation. One time, on the bus with James N. Buffum, they were both thrown off an Eastern Railroad train just because Douglass refused to sit on the segregated railroad coach. He was a stubborn but intelligent man, and in 1843, he joined several other speakers at the American Anti-Slavery Society Convention. This was a 6-month tour that included visits to different meeting halls throughout the eastern and midwestern United States. Douglass faced different violent attacks by slavery supporters during this tour. One time, he was attacked by an angry mob while he delivered a lecture in Pendleton, Indiana. They chased and beat him severely until a local Quaker family came to his rescue. The attackers broke his hands. The wounds eventually healed, but improperly, causing him slight pains for the rest of his life. While it was clear that Douglass was law-abiding and committed to the abolition of slavery, in a conversation with Garrison he explained, "I have no love for America. As such, I have no patriotism. I have no country. What country do I have? The institutions of this country do not know me. They do not recognize me as a man." As a young man, Douglass became very popular for his speeches against slavery, and many of his friends and mentors were afraid that his popularity was going to draw the attention of his former owner, who might try to search and reclaim him like a property. Douglass later took the advice of his friends and went on tour to Ireland, just like several other slaves have done in the past. Frederick Douglass was 27 years old when he arrived in Dublin on the 31st of August, 1845. He had crossed the Atlantic from Boston to Liverpool and then traveled on to Ireland. When he got there, he confessed about the great feeling of being free from American racial discrimination. He shared his experience, stating how his travel to Ireland changed him and made him realize his humanity and how he was no different from a white man. He writes, 11 days and a half gone, and I have crossed 3,000 miles of the perilous deep. Instead of a democratic government, I am under a monarchical government. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft gray fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. I gaze around in vain for one who will question my equal humanity, claim me as his slave, or offer me an insult. I employ a cab. I am seated beside white people. I reach the hotel. I enter the same door. I am shown into the same parlor. I dine at the same table, and no one is offended. I find myself regarded and treated at every turn with the kindness and deference paid to white people. When I go to church, I am met by no upturned nose and scornful lip to tell me, "We don't allow niggers in here." While his visit to Ireland had an impact on his mind, he was still astounded by the great levels of poverty in the country. He visited the country when it was just entering the early stages of the Irish potato famine. He recounts how much of the hunger and poverty reminded him of his former condition as a slave. Such was the extreme poverty he saw there that even made him feel ashamed of questioning American slavery. While in Ireland, he became friends with Daniel O'Connell, a great Irish nationalist and a champion for the abolition of the slave trade. He became a great inspiration to Douglass and inspired him in his quest to end slavery. After some time, Douglass moved to England, and over there, he delivered the London reception speech. This would later become one of his most famous speeches. In the speech, Douglass expresses his disappointment on how the English people, with all their liberty and Christianity, still watched many others within their country denied basic rights and freedom. In the speech, he said, "What is it to be thought of a nation boasting of its liberty, boasting of its humanity, boasting of its Christianity, boasting of its love of justice and purity, and yet having within its own borders 3 million persons denied by law the right of marriage? I need not lift up the veil by giving you any experience of my own. Everyone that can put two ideas together must see the most fearful results from such a state of things." In England, Douglass remarked that he was treated not as a color, but as a man. Before he left England, Douglass met with Thomas Clarkson, who was one of the last living British abolitionists, who succeeded in persuading the Parliament to abolish slavery in Great Britain's colonies. Douglass spent 2 years in Ireland and Great Britain, lecturing in churches and chapels. A large crowd usually came to listen to him talk. It was in England that he finally gained his freedom legally, as British supporters raised funds to buy his freedom from his American owner Thomas Auld. He later traveled to Scotland and was appointed Scotland's anti-slavery agent. He made several anti-slavery speeches and wrote several letters back to the United States. Although many of his supporters had tried to persuade him to remain in England, Douglass insisted that he must return to the United States to be with his wife and to liberate many of his brethren still in slavery. He returned to the US in 1847 and used the 500 pounds, which is equivalent to about $50,000 currently, given to him by the British supporters to start the North Star. This was his first abolitionist paper, and it was published from the base of the Memorial AME Zion Church in Rochester, New York. The motto of the newspaper was, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." The newspaper was a huge success, and together with the AME Church, he joined in amplifying the voice of the freedmen community and opposing the American Colonization Society. This society was responsible for the Back to Africa campaign. Their aim was to send freed African Americans back to Africa. Also, he and his wife provided lodging and services for the Underground Railroad and helped more than 400 escaped slaves. In 1848, 10 years after his escape, Douglass wrote an open letter addressed to his former owner. In this letter, Douglass aimed at making Thomas Auld realize how unfortunate he is to be a slave owner. He boasts about his new life, his 4 children, and his improved circumstances, without failing to remind Thomas of how cruelly he was treated. In the letter, he asked Thomas how he would feel if one of his daughters was taken into slavery. Frederick wrote angrily, "Oh, Sir, a slaveholder never appears to me so completely an agent of hell as when I think of and look upon my dear children. It is then that my feelings rise above my control. The grim horrors of slavery rise in all their ghastly terror before me, and the wails of millions pierce my heart and chill my blood. I remember the chain, the gag, the bloody whip, the death-like gloom overshadowing the broken spirit of the fettered bondman, the appalling liability of his being torn away from his wife and children and sold like a beast in the market." However, he ended by wishing Thomas no harm and stating that he was welcome to his home and neither would he deny him anything good if he was in a position to assist him. Douglass was also actively involved in the movement for women's rights. He was the only African American to attend the Seneca Falls Convention, a gathering of women's rights activists in New York in 1848. As usual, he gave a powerful speech at the conference. He clarified that women were essential to the success of any government. He states that, in this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world. His newspaper, the North Star, also started publishing articles and essays on women's rights issues. The paper was finally changed to Frederick Douglass's paper in 1851 and was published until 1860, just before the start of the Civil War. Frederick Douglass had 5 children with Anna Murray, who remained a loyal supporter of her husband's works and assisted him a great deal. While there were several speculations that Douglass was having an affair with 2 women he worked with, there was no evidence of such. One of the women, Ottilie Assing, was a journalist from Germany who visited Douglass in 1856 and requested permission to translate 2 of his books, My Bondage and My Freedom, into German. They both spent a lot of time together while she stayed in his house for several months. While it was reported that Assing held Anna Douglass in contempt and even secretly hoped that Douglass would leave her, Frederick remained faithful to Anna until her eventual death in 1884. 2 years after Anna's death, Douglass married again to Helen Pitts, a white suffragist and abolitionist from New York. Earlier, she worked on a radical feminist publication named Alpha while she was in Washington, D.C., and later became Douglass's secretary. Assing committed suicide after hearing of the marriage between Douglass and Pitts. Upon her death, she bequeathed Douglass a $13,000 trust fund, a large album, and his choice of books from her library. The marriage between Pitts and Douglass was a highly controversial one at the time. This was the era when the marriage between colored and white people was frowned upon. Another issue was that Pitts was 20 years younger than Douglass. This made the Pitts family cut off all ties with her. Even Douglass's children thought that the marriage was an insult to their mother. However, Douglass responded to the several allegations, stating that his marriage to Anna was because she was a person of color like his mother, and his second marriage was to someone the color of his father. Frederick Douglass was an active role and participant in the Civil War. At the time of the war, he was one of the most famous black men in the country. He was popular for his powerful oratory on the condition of the black man and his agitation on other issues like women's rights. Whenever he spoke, thousands of people gathered to listen to him talk. During the Civil War, Douglass and several other abolitionists strongly suggested to Lincoln to allow African Americans to fight in the war, since it was a fight to end their slavery and determine their freedom. Lincoln finally showed African American soldiers into the Union Army, and Douglass was put in charge of the recruitment process. 3 of his sons were actively involved in the war. Douglass fought for the equality of his people and ensured that all African American soldiers were treated with respect. In 1863, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation called for the liberation and freedom of all slaves in the Confederate-held territory. After Lincoln's assassination, Douglass conferred with President Andres Johnson, demanding for suffrage for all African Americans. After the Civil War, he received several political appointments and served as the president of the Reconstruction-era Freedmen's Savings Bank. In 1872, Douglass became the first African American nominated for Vice President of the United States. He was nominated as the running mate to Victoria Woodhull of the Equal Rights Party. He was nominated without his knowledge. He didn't campaign and never acknowledged the nomination. That year, he was the presidential elector at large for the state of New York and took the state's votes to Washington, D.C. He moved to Washington, D.C. after his home in Rochester was burnt down. Over there, he continued speaking and working for voting rights and actual exercise of suffrage for the African Americans. In 1877, he was named by Rutherford B. Hayes as the United States Marshal for the District of Columbia. Frederick Douglass was the first person of color to be so named. That same year, Douglass visited his former slave master, Thomas Auld, on his deathbed, and the 2 men reconciled. In 1881, Douglass published the final edition of his autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. It was later updated in 1892. Douglass continued his work and speaking engagements all over the world. In 1889, he was appointed by President Benjamin Harrison to be the Consul General to the Republic of Haiti. 2 years later, he resigned from the commission after he found out that the American president intended to gain permanent access to Haitian territory, despite the country's opposition to this. In 1892, Douglass constructed houses which were rented out to African Americans. It was called the Douglass Place, and in 2003, it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, sitting for more portraits than even Abraham Lincoln. He was keen on taking many photographs, believing that photography was an important political tool for achieving civil rights, as it portrays African Americans fairly and accurately. In all of his photographs, he intentionally refused to smile for the camera so as not to play into the racist caricature of a happy slave. He often looked directly into the camera and confronted the viewer with a stern look. Douglass died at the age of 77 after suffering a massive heart attack, just after he returned from speaking at a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington in February 1895. His funeral was held at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. Thousands of people attended his funeral. United States senators and Supreme Court judges were pallbearers. His coffin was taken to Rochester, New York, where he had lived for 25 years. Frederick Douglass was buried next to Anna in the Douglass family plot of Mount Hope Cemetery, Rochester's premier memorial park. His grave is one of the most viewed in the cemetery. A marker, which was erected by the University of Rochester, describes Douglass as escaped slave, abolitionist, suffragist, journalist, and statesman, founder of the civil rights movement in America.